Okay, for those of you joining, we will be starting in just a moment. We just want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to sign on as I see people are slowly trickling in. Thanks for your patience. Okay, just going to give just another second for people to join. I see that we've got a really nice hearty participation today, so I'm excited for us to get started. Okay, so in the interest of time, I think we are going to get started now. I know that we're a few minutes past the hour, so I appreciate you guys all joining us today. My name is Nicole Jarvis. I'm the Assistant Director of Programs at Cancer and Careers, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a national nonprofit and the only program of its kind solely dedicated to empowering and educating people with cancer to thrive in their working environment. So we do this through our comprehensive website, our free publications in English and Spanish, as well as our career coaching. We also offer additional seminars targeted at employees with cancer and their colleagues and healthcare providers. And certainly employers and caregivers benefit from this information as well. We're also currently in the process of developing resources that directly address the employment-related challenges that are being faced by cancer survivors during this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So to stay informed about those programs as they are rolled out, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter if you're not already signed up, and by visiting our website at cancerandcareers.org, where you'll be able to access all of our other programs and publications free of charge. Now, before we begin, a few housekeeping items related to accreditation. Oops, sorry, we're having a little bit of technical problems with our they're moving. Okay. So today's webinar is accredited by ANCC, ASWB, the New York State Education Department State Board for Social Work, the California Board of Registered Nursing, and the Society for Human Resource Management. Now, if you plan on requesting continuing education credit for this program from any of these accrediting bodies, please proceed with the following steps. First, you must log in individually. Participants who listen in on someone else's line will not receive credit. Second, you must complete and submit the evaluation and post-test, as well as receive a passing grade of at least 80% on the post-test. Following today's session, you'll receive an email with all of this information. The follow-up email will be sent no later than 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, September 15th, and certificates will be emailed within 4 weeks. Also, please note the planners and presenters for this program have not disclosed any pertinent financial relationships or conflicts of interest, and that no commercial support was provided for this program. So thanks in part to direct support from Genentech, HSN, and QVC, Cancer and Careers is able to offer this 8th year of the Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series. This program was really created to provide patients and survivors, as well as their healthcare team and employers, with concise, targeted information about the work-related issues that tend to arise after a cancer diagnosis. Additionally, we'd like to recognize Cancer and Careers year-round sponsors who support all of our core programs and allow us to continue providing all resources and services free of charge. So bringing us to why we're here today. Today's session is communicating effectively. We're going to be exploring various ways to enhance our communication style. To help us explore this topic, I'm delighted to introduce Rachel Becker. Rachel is our Deputy Director at Cancer and Careers and one of our in-house social workers. She's been with CAC for 8 years, having previously worked as Head of Client Services at Care Planners, as well as in a clinical capacity at New York Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital and the Jewish Child Care Association of New York. She also completed a fellowship in psycho-oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. At the end of the webinar, if there is time, there will be a question and answer period. Any questions you would like answered should be entered into the Q&A box, which is located either at the top or the bottom of your screen. Please don't ask questions for Rachel in the chat box. If you are joining us via phone today, you can press *9, which will alert us of your question. I also want to mention that you can participate in today's session using the chat box. However, if you choose to use it, please know that you will not be able to do so anonymously. Your name or whatever name is attached to your Zoom account will be posted in the chat box. So if you do prefer to remain anonymous, please don't post in the chat box. That said, there is an option to ask your questions anonymously in the Q&A box. So that is available for you to communicate with either myself or Rachel or the other CAC staff behind the scenes if there's something you'd like to ask or mention anonymously. So without further ado, I will now hand it over to Rachel to get us started. Rachel?
Thank you so much, Nicole. Hang on a second while I turn on my camera. There we go. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. I'm really excited to have so many of you on the line. So, as you may know, I hope you know, this is the first of 2 sessions that we are presenting this fall that are focused on effective communications, either on the job or when job hunting. And today was designed to define some terms and ideas and overall start to really think about the big picture of what it means to be an effective communicator. And then in the next session, we're going to have a more rubber meets the road kind of feel to it, where we'll talk about some tips and tools that can be useful for putting these concepts into practice. But for today, as you can see on this slide, our discussion is going to focus on understanding effective communication and why it's important. We're going to talk about personal communication styles, what they are, how to identify yours and others. And then we're also going to start exploring the topic of disclosure and things to consider when making disclosure decisions. Now, before we dig in, I do want to acknowledge that we know that those of you on this call who have received a cancer diagnosis are likely in different places in terms of your lived experiences. Some of you may have only recently been diagnosed and so are just starting to think through how life and treatment and work are going to come together. Others may be in the middle of treatment and either working or looking for a new job. Maybe treatment is behind you, but you're still experiencing some side effects. Or perhaps you're here today because someone you love has cancer and you're gathering information for them or for yourself so that you can do a better job of balancing work and caregiving. Maybe your circumstances are something else entirely that I haven't mentioned, but wherever you are, our hope is that you will leave this session today with some solid practical information that is applicable for you, either now or in the future if and when your circumstances changed. And as Nicole mentioned, if you have any specific questions that aren't being addressed, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box so we have those for chat at the end of the session. If we don't get to them today, we will do our best to get back to you as soon as possible outside of today's session. So let's jump right into exploring that big picture and why it's important to think about what it means to communicate effectively in the context of life after a cancer diagnosis. So while our bigger focus for today is on strategic communications related to work, both on the job and when looking for a new job, it's important to note that there are also areas outside of work where you might need or want to use some deliberate communication strategies as well. For example, and I'm guessing many of you may already have experienced this, it can be very helpful to prepare for any conversations you may be having with your healthcare team, because there's often a limited amount of time available during appointments, or if you're admitted to the hospital and the only chance to talk to your doctor is when they drop by during rounds. Preparing a list of questions you have or topics you'd like to discuss can help ensure you make the best use of the limited time you have with them. Similarly, some conversations with family or other loved ones may benefit from advanced preparation, such as if you're sharing news about your diagnosis or updates about your treatment plan. And it can also be important to think strategically about the things that you may post online, whether it's social media or on a blog or anywhere else that you might be posting, since our online behaviors can have a real impact on our work lives. And we're going to spend much more time talking about these over the course of the 2 sessions. But as we move forward, I encourage you to be open to the idea that while a lot of these concepts that we're going to talk about are being shared under the umbrella of being job or job search related, they may also be used effectively in other areas of life as well. So another place in your post-diagnosis life where it may be helpful to apply some communication strategies has to do with recasting yourself in terms of how others around you may view you, or the way that they may behave towards you as a result of what's going on medically. Now, obviously, we wish it weren't the case that people sometimes act differently when they find out something that's going on with our health, but we do frequently hear from people who are concerned that having shared a diagnosis, they're either always going to be seen as the cancer person in their workplace, or that behaviors towards them might continue to be a little bit different. And this often leads them to wonder if there's anything that can be done to help shift their coworkers' focus so that they're once again seen as the full and robust human that they are, who brings tons of work skills to the table, as well as personality and interests, and so on and so forth. There are also people who come to us wanting to know if there's a nice way or a professional way to say to their coworkers or supervisors, hey, do you think you could stop always bringing up my cancer? That can be an understandably frustrating situation and kind of tricky to address, particularly if it's clear that the people who are asking about your health have good intentions, but just aren't considering how the question might be making you feel. And then, of course, there are numerous other challenges to communication that you might find yourself facing in a work context. We have a few common ones listed here on the slide. And I'd also like to now invite all of you to maybe share some specific communication challenges that you've faced at work. Or if you're a healthcare professional, perhaps a challenge that someone with a diagnosis has told you about. So if you'd like to go ahead and enter any of those into the chat box right now, if there's anything that comes to mind. It's also okay if that's not the case. Okay, so it looks like it's pretty quiet in the chat box right now, which I completely understand. Sometimes it's not always easy to articulate what the challenges are that we're facing. We just know that we're facing them. But some of the things that we do hear about frequently, besides the ones that are on the slide, like fear of stigma or being seen as less productive, you know, some people find that there are certain topics that are just more difficult to talk about than others. Sometimes people have a hard time knowing how to start a conversation or to end it or to move to a different place. Oh, I see in the chat box, Stephanie has said weak. I'm not exactly sure what that means. Concern about sharing too much. Oh, here we go. Now they're all coming in. Being assigned to less intensive projects because we fear we can't handle it. Yep. People inquiring is not genuine in their concerns. You know, we hear about that a lot. It is, it's such a just kind of a standard in life to say like, hey, how are you doing? And people don't necessarily, sometimes feels like people don't mean that. They're just saying that. So I feel that as well. Comforting others out of over our own diagnosis. Wow. Yeah, that one is big and that can be very tiring. Being seen as less production, being seen as a person who fears accommodation. Yep, sharing too much, being given too many speaking engagements. Sometimes I feel like I'm being taken advantage of. Yeah, concerns that you might be being talked about behind your back. So there's a lot of concerns that we're seeing in this chat box, which I think really validates that that challenges communicating at work can be challenging. Often the perceptions can be very challenging. And I want to thank you all for being so candid with your responses. I really do. You know, I was talking about some of the other common ones that we hear about a lot. People often will talk to us about how they have their own personal feelings about communicating. Some people don't really like communicating, or they have concerns about the way that they put together ideas or what outcomes might be. And, you know, those feelings play a role as well. It's not always intuitive how to navigate those feelings. It's not always intuitive how to navigate any of those challenges, which is part of the reason that we have this series that we're running this year. But I would argue that everyone comes up against communication challenges in their lives. And clearly we're seeing that so many on this call have faced their own personal challenges in their work environments, perhaps in your personal lives as well, in terms of knowing how to communicate. But again, those challenges can come up regardless of who we are, what our job is, what the level of education, health status, or any of the other of our aspects of personal identity. So again, just knowing that you're not alone, and we're going to spend this session and the next one as well talking about some ideas and concepts and practical ways to better address communication challenges in our lives. So let's continue by looking at some communication basics so that we can all move forward with a shared understanding of some key terms and concepts. So let's start by asking the question, what is communication? Well, one definition of communication is that it is a process through which information, ideas, and or emotions are shared between two or more people. So in other words, communication is what gives us the power to meaningfully connect with others. And it can occur in a number of ways. It may happen through audible communication, such as spoken words. It also may involve sounds that are not verbal, not actually words, but things like grunting or sighing and so on. And then, of course, not all communications are received through our ears. They may be written out, or they may occur through sign language. Our behavior around others and our body language can also convey information or clues about what we're thinking and feeling. And it's also important to note that sometimes our communications happen in a way that are thought out and deliberate, but that is not always the case. Sometimes we end up sharing ideas or information based on a spur of the moment decision or impulse. And sometimes details get shared with others subconsciously without us even knowing that we are doing it. Like when we're nervous and our hands start shaking, or if our foot starts tapping repeatedly. So really a wide variety of things that might fall under the umbrella of communication. But before we define what specifically effective communication is, I'd like to challenge some common misconceptions about it. One misconception is that you are either born a good communicator or you are not, and there is not really middle ground. And while there are certainly people who are born with maybe more of a knack for communicating well is a skill. And like any skill, it can be practiced and it can be learned. There is a misconception that full disclosure is the best policy. And while there's some truth to the idea that honesty is the best policy, it is not always the best approach to share absolutely everything. And it is possible to still be honest and also not include every last detail. And so we're going to unpack that more as we go along. Talking is the best way to effectively communicate. That is another common misconception. We just talked a little bit about that on the last slide. And then, of course, another misconception is that we are only ever given a single chance for an effective communication. And this is very rarely the case, particularly when it comes to work-related conversations. And we're going to unpack this idea as well as all of the others and some more as we continue through here. So what specifically does make communication effective? Well, the first key concept to consider is that effective communication is a two-way street and involves both sharing our thoughts and ideas while also investing energy in receiving and absorbing the ideas that are being shared by whoever it is that we're communicating with. So this means not only being mindful to get across your own perspective in a way that is clear and organized, but also really paying attention to what that other person is trying to get across. consider what they're bringing to the table in terms of their own perspective, and not being afraid to ask clarifying questions if you're not entirely sure what is being driven at, what they're trying to communicate with you and get across to you. It's much better to make sure that everyone is on the same page up front by asking clarifying questions during a conversation than wishing later that you'd ironed out details better beforehand. Expressing gratitude when it's appropriate is also a best practice. So while you might assume that the person you're communicating with knows that you're appreciative, the reality is that often people don't know, or it's not front of mind if we don't tell them directly. And saying a simple thank you can go a very long way when we're looking to communicate effectively. Another best practice can be summarizing what was discussed when we come to the end of a conversation. So that might mean taking a minute or two before ending a phone call to review what next steps are. Or it might mean sending an email after the fact to say, thank you for the conversation earlier, to recap what we discussed, and then you list out whatever it is that you talked about. And this is tied into the idea we brought up on the last slide, which is that effective communication isn't necessarily limited to being a one-time event. In fact, it should be something that happens regularly. Most of us who have jobs can relate to the idea, or who have ever worked, whether or not we have a job right now, can relate to the idea that life in general and our work tasks and projects, they're all continuously evolving. Sometimes that happens in unexpected ways. So regular check-ins, whether they're 5-minute overviews or longer deep dives, are often necessary to make sure that communications are as beneficial as possible to everyone involved. Also, it's important to note that sometimes effective communication very purposely takes place over more than one conversation. Additionally, effective communication incorporates emotional regulation, which means having the goal of staying centered so that what you're feeling doesn't play too much of a role in how you're expressing yourself. And this is particularly important when we think about work communications, because while our family members or loved ones may ultimately be forgiving if we, say, get angry or annoyed with them, and that starts to come through with how they're communicating, sharp words or intense energy on the job or in a job interview often land quite differently. And sometimes that can have long-term consequences that are hard or even impossible to move on from. Asking for help when you need it is also an essential part of communicating effectively. Every single person on the planet, no matter their health status or job title or all of those other personal characteristics I listed earlier, everyone, all of us, need help from time to time. And so asking for it shouldn't be something that you shy away from, particularly at work. And of course, effective communications should result in a clear understanding of any next steps, whether that's treatment related with your healthcare team, or in terms of a project at work, or a plan for taking time off, or whatever. And that can be critical to include in those conversation recaps that we discussed on the last slide. Now, moving on to why effective communication is important on the job, particularly after a cancer diagnosis. Well, for one, it helps to keep the lines of communication open. So the vast majority of us who work don't do so in a vacuum. We usually somehow collaborate with others in order to get our jobs done. And the best way to make sure that everyone knows what they should be doing and when and how to do it and so on is to make sure that the information and ideas are moving back and forth freely and regularly. In the case of someone who may be working part-time during their cancer treatment, or who has taken some time off and is now returning to their job, effective communication can help remind your boss and your coworkers that you're still a valuable and capable contributor to the team. Effective communications on the job can also eliminate questions or assumptions that lead to anxiety or mistrust. For example, if you have a desk and are working remotely, either as a reasonable accommodation during treatment or because of a decision your organization made in response to COVID, and you're going to step away from your computer for more than a few minutes, it can be a good idea to message your team to let them know that you won't be available for a little while, so that if someone reaches out and doesn't get you, they don't make the assumption that you're taking a nap or sitting on your couch eating bonbons when you should be working. In fact, getting in the habit of regularly communicating can actually build a sense of confidence and reassurance about who you are as a worker. So if, for example, you do accidentally step away from your computer and forget to tell your team, they'll default to thinking, oh, something unexpected might have come up, and I'm sure I'll hear from them soon, rather than having an anxious response or assuming something negative about your work ethic. But with all of that said, what's really essential to remember as you're thinking about communicating strategically and effectively is that you do not have to be a completely open book about everything going on in your life. You can make choices about what specific details get shared, whether it's about you personally or what is something related to a work task. You can make choices about whether or not something gets shared at all. And you also might make a choice to share nothing. We're going to circle back to that concept in a few slides. Effective communications are clearly also very important during job searches. First, clear communication is absolutely key to opening the door to potential interviews, whether that's through networking or in a cover letter or a well-constructed resume. And what it boils down to is using these communications to help people understand what kind of job you're looking for, who you are, and what you bring to the table. It's also the case that most pre-interview communications, like the one I just listed, involve making the best possible use of limited space. Cover letters shouldn't run more than a few paragraphs. Resumes and LinkedIn profiles should be succinct. And in networking, it's smart to know how to quickly share details in real-time conversations so that you don't lose other people's attention. And all of that requires planning and skill. And then in terms of interviewing successfully, your overall goal, no matter who you are or what job you might be interviewing for, is always to communicate in ways that show the person across the table or on the Zoom screen or however you might be communicating that you are the savviest, most qualified candidate for the role that you're interviewing for. And we're going to spend more time talking about how to effectively communicate during a job search in our next session. We'll talk about what specifically that can look like. How each of us goes about communicating can vary quite a bit from person to person. And it's based on individual factors such as personality, cultural background, the way we were raised, and so on and so forth. And the way a specific person expresses information or their ideas is referred to as their communication style. So very important to note that there is no one correct communication style. And a good place to start figuring out what your individual communication style is to ask yourself what your feelings are about sharing. We talked about this a little bit earlier. And so if you did at that point pause to say, hey, how do I feel about sharing, and kind of ask that question of yourself, you have already started thinking about your individual communication style. Whatever your particular feelings are about sharing and communicating overall are valid. The key is really to know that they play a role in shaping your communication style that can benefit you to be aware of. Now, while thinking about communication at work, it's also smart to evaluate how your workplace culture impacts your feelings about communicating on the job. Is the environment where you work like a second family, where people joke around and share details about their weekends and their families? Or is the overall tone more corporate and buttoned up and laser focused on the task at hand? And how does this impact the way you do or don't communicate at work? Does it have an effect on your feelings about whether or not to disclose? Additionally, understanding what your own communication style is can help you become a much more effective communicator, because it helps you truly own your strengths in getting across information and ideas. As well, it helps you to be aware of the places where there is room for improvement. And then beyond that, understanding the individual communication styles of the people around you can help you to know how to target your communications in a way that helps them to best understand your message, as well as things for you to keep in mind as you receive whatever they're trying to share with you. So in case the way that I explained that was a little confusing or a lot confusing, we're going to spend the next few slides going into more detail. So as you might imagine, a number of career coaches and other employment professionals have done some really good thinking about and research into communication styles. And among them is a man named Mark Murphy, who is an author and leadership coach, who has developed a model that outlines 4 primary communication styles. So in talking about these 4 styles, Murphy says that there are 2 major philosophical differences that separate them. The first is that people tend to communicate either more with emotion and feelings or with data, numbers, and facts. So for example, if you have 2 people working at an animal rescue, a more emotional communicator might say, I feel like we're doing well with our winter adoption push. Whereas a more data-driven communicator might say 92% of the dogs we're currently fostering have received adoption applications. Both are saying something similar, but how exactly they are saying it is different because of their different communication styles. And then the second difference has to do with the arc that people use to convey information. So some go in a straight line, make point A, then point B, then point C, and so on. And it's all very logical and sequential. And then there are others who share information in a more roundabout way, or maybe they even skip details entirely. Now we're about to walk through exactly what Murphy's 4 styles are, but before we do, a reminder that there are many ways of thinking about communication style. We thought that Murphy's was just a really strong example, which is why we wanted to share it with you. And also to remember that no one of these 4 styles is better than the others. They're all on equal footing here, and their purpose is really to best describe differences and help you understand your personal style. So I encourage you to think about which of these resonates with you, and also maybe which may describe some of the people that you work with. So the first communication style that Murphy identifies is the analytical communicator. So this is a person who uses facts and data to communicate rather than communicating emotionally. They are more likely to use precise language, and they tend to express themselves logically or in that straight A to B to C line that I was just talking about. Those are their strengths in terms of how they express themselves. Now, on the other hand, some things for analytical communicators to be aware of include coming across to others as cold or unfeeling. It's also not uncommon for people in this group to find themselves getting frustrated with someone less specific or number-driven. So that might mean that they find themselves getting a little brusque in their replies, or maybe even stop paying attention. And that can impact how effective the back and forth communication ultimately is. So if you recognize yourself in this description, those may be things to monitor or work on. Another point to keep in mind if you're an analytical communicator is that it may be challenging for you to talk about some of the unknowns that come along with a cancer diagnosis and treatment. Because, as you may be able to relate to already, the cancer experience is fluid. It doesn't always move in a straight line. So keep in mind that your strong ability to be logical and apply numbers and facts and data might not be of service here. Next, we have the intuitive communicator. And this is someone whose strengths include both being able to describe the big picture succinctly and also to cut right to the bottom line without giving a lot of detail, which can be very effective in certain work environments. That said, if this describes you, please keep in mind that you can come across as impatient to others who do require details, either to get a point across or to fully absorb what's being shared. And then as we think about how this might impact work communications during cancer, it's important to know that there may be times where a lot of details are necessary. For example, if you're going to be out for a few weeks for surgery and a colleague is going to cover a project while you're out, handing it off to them may require that you really unpack the individual steps and components to make sure that they have a full and comprehensive understanding of how to successfully do what you need them to do. So you remember on the last slide, I mentioned that there are people who really appreciate detailed communications. Murphy called them functional communicators. And it's not necessarily the facts and data and numbers that our analytical communicators like to use that appeal to functional communicators. Rather, they like the kinds of details that are required for planning in advance. They tend to communicate information in a very step-by-step way, are often sought after for their exceptional strategizing and organizational skills. However, if you fall into this category, you want to make sure you're sharing just the right amount of detail and not too much. Because if you do so, you can risk losing the other person's attention. Functional communicators should also be mindful of oversharing during disclosure conversations. And so a helpful tip is to plan for those discussions by writing down everything that you might possibly say, and then going back through to edit out the details that aren't totally necessary right now. And we're going to discuss more about disclosure shortly. Now, the fourth group of Murphy's communication styles is called personal communicator. And this is the group that frequently uses emotions to communicate. So this means that they're strong empathizers, they listen well, they tend to be very diplomatic. And these are all very, very challenging skills to teach. So they're wonderful traits to come by naturally. And it's also the case that being emotional in a work environment can be positive. For example, feeling passionate about your work and letting that shine through can actually strengthen your communication. But on the other side of the coin, personal communicators are going to want to be mindful about letting emotions overtake the conversation, particularly heavier emotions. So it can be a good idea to write out notes or a sort of script for yourself to keep grounded during disclosure discussions if your feelings start to build. Also, if you know you're going to be having a difficult conversation with a less emotional communicator, like an analytical communicator, you might want to think through how that more muted behavior could potentially impact the way you feel. And then how are you going to navigate any feelings that might come up? So now that we've gone through Murphy's 4 communication styles, I'm going to ask Sissy, who's on the back end, to throw up a poll, because I would love to learn more about what we have in the room in terms of your personal communication styles and which you relate to. Thank you, Sissy, for showing that up. So this poll is anonymous. You are the only person who's going to know how you answer. This is really just so we can get a read of the bigger group. So I'm going to let that run for a few more seconds while the responses come in, because they are still coming in. All right, Sissy, you want to push that through? So we have a lot of personal communicators in the room today. And then functional and intuitive communicator are tied for second place, and analytical communicator after that. So we really do have a mix, and analytical communicator is not too far behind amongst those of you who responded. And then, of course, I also want to shout out the people who said that their personal communication style doesn't quite fit any of these. I totally hear that. I actually think that some people may see a little bit of themselves in all of the categories sometimes. So again, this is the thought exercise. There's no right answer, and a useful framework for thinking about your personal communication style. Okay, so moving on now to the topic of disclosing your cancer diagnosis. As I've mentioned throughout today, it's important to be thoughtful and strategic when making decisions about when and how you share in your life, or even if you disclose at all. And what we often encourage is developing a personal disclosure plan. This isn't because there are right or wrong ways to share information, but rather because spending some time really thinking about what's going to work for you and then making choices based on what you kind of discover in that process can help you feel more confident about the way you're having these conversations. So first, you want to think about what, if any, information about your cancer experience you're going to share, where you're going to share it. Are these going to be in-person conversations? What, if anything, are you going to post online? And then once you've made those decisions, you also want to communicate them to people in your network, particularly if you have specific preferences about posting online. And we'll get to a little bit more on online posting shortly. And then it's also really important to consider how you present any written communications. So if you have any cancer community experience that you might want to talk about online or in resume, or just broadly thinking about how your resumes and cover letters are crafted, that's going to be important to make some disclosure decisions about as well. We're going to talk more about that right now. So people often reach out to us because they're not sure about whether or not there is a responsibility to disclose and to discuss their diagnosis or treatment plans at work. And if you're wondering whether or not you have to share news of your diagnosis, I am here to tell you now that although there may be exceptions, in most instances, there is not a requirement or an obligation to share details about your health or health history with an employer, nor can they ask. Again, there can be some exceptions, but generally speaking, there's no requirement. However, people may decide to disclose for a variety of reasons. And there can be both benefits and unwanted consequences to disclosure in the workplace. We talked about that. We saw that happening in the chat box. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about what's going to work for you and stick to choices that feel right for you and your unique circumstances. So some things to consider include how treatment's going to interfere with your ability to perform your job. If there are going to be changes to the way that you do your job, if your energy levels might slow down, perhaps you want to share some information so that your supervisors understand why your job performance may be changing. There also might be potential legal benefits to sharing this information. We're not going to spend a lot of time today, or really any time today, talking about legal protections, but there is information about various legal protections and laws that might help you in the workplace all over the Cancer and Careers website. We have a link to a fantastic informational article at the bottom of the screen and some archived webinars. You can always reach out to us for more details on that. Also important to note that people may want to disclose because they are sharers, and for them, feeling, keeping this kind of information for themselves might feel inorganic. Others might feel differently. Maybe they're more private at work, either about their personal lives or about their medical information specifically, and so they would prefer to share as little as possible and only if it's necessary. We also get asked a lot, who should I tell? And that's going to vary depending on you and your specific circumstances. And it's also possible that you may find yourself having to have more than one disclosure conversation. So if that's the case, we recommend starting with a person it's going to be easiest to talk to. For many people, that's a direct supervisor because it's someone with whom they have an ongoing conversation and who can be an advocate for them with higher ups. But it's also important to bear in mind that most managers aren't trained to be managers. So this might be the first time that they're having this type of conversation, and they could feel in uncharted territory themselves. So unfortunately, when that is the case, it sometimes puts the burden on the person who has the cancer diagnosis to help teach that manager about what's going on with them, about what to do next. And Cancer and Careers has a manager's toolkit, which there's also a link to on the bottom of this slide, and which was created because people in our community asked us for something concrete that they could take with them into these conversations to help with that circumstance if it occurs. So you can check that out at the link on the bottom of our slide. Now, when we think about whether or not to disclose or how much to share, it's also important to consider what you know about the possible side effects that you're likely to experience, particularly if you are choosing not to disclose either at all or widely within the organization. And this is because the changes that the body goes through during treatment, they might be visible side effects like hair loss or skin changes, or they could be invisible side effects like cognitive challenges or fatigue. Often those things can invite questions from the people around you and disclose information even if your words don't. So if you're someone who isn't planning to share or who has already decided not to disclose widely what's going on with you, it can be a good idea to have a sense of the types of changes you're likely to experience, whether those might be perceived by your coworkers in a way that invites questions. And then from there, it's about knowing how to have prepared responses so that you don't find yourself caught off guard. And there is going to be a lot of time spent in our next session talking about how to prepare responses. So if you're not already registered for that session, I definitely recommend doing so. Now, with all of that said, if you do decide that you're going to disclose at work, the idea of simply getting the ball rolling can be intimidating. So on this slide, we have a couple of examples for how you might start that conversation. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read them out loud. I'm going to leave you to read them. They're also in the slide deck that was shared with you yesterday. And if any of the exact language on this slide works for you, please do feel free to use it. But the reality is that the exact same language isn't going to work for everyone because not everyone communicates in the same way. And as Nicole mentioned at the beginning of the session, I'm a social worker. She is actually also a social worker, and we have some wonderful people on staff who are infinitely qualified to help you think about some language that might work for you. So you can always reach out to us for an appointment to do just that. So as you're thinking about all of this, it can be helpful to think about disclosure as a spectrum. And we already talked about the fact that, generally speaking, you are not required or obligated to share your health or health history, nor can employers ask. And there is a spectrum of choices that people might make in terms of why they make decisions to or not, and then to share or not. And then, of course, a spectrum of detail in terms of how much they do actually share. Disclosing is typically not an all or nothing scenario. You can always start by sharing just a small piece of information that's relevant and then share more later if something else becomes relevant down the road. But on that note, keep in mind that once you share something, it's pretty impossible to unshare it. It's kind of like getting toothpaste out of the tube. Once it's out there, it's out there. So it is often a good practice to start by sharing less and then perhaps sharing more as circumstances evolve or if it becomes necessary. Additionally, it's important to stick to what you know to be true and not the what ifs when it comes to disclosure conversation. So getting accurate information from your healthcare provider around timelines and treatment protocols can be helpful. But you don't want to give your employer or anyone you work with the impression that things are set in stone, because the reality is that circumstances change, often unexpectedly, and it can be uncomfortable to have to walk back a promise that you made early on before you knew how things would play out. It's much better to let them know upfront that you are telling them what you know now is what you know now, but it may be different 6 weeks from now or 6 months from now, and that you will continue to communicate with them as events unfold. Ensuring your employer that the dialogue is going to be ongoing and open can help give them confidence in the process. So turning now to the topic of disclosure during a job search. This is a question that comes up frequently. People often ask, should I disclose my cancer diagnosis in a cover letter or a resume, either as a way to explain a gap or as an example of skills and experiences? Now, ultimately, your job search is yours, and it's up to you to conduct it in the way that feels right for you. However, I will share with you that there have been some studies done that have shown that people who disclose cancer status or another medical issue or disability in a cover letter or on a resume are less likely to be called in for an interview. Now, obviously, we wish this weren't the case, and it is not always the case, but we do know that it is possible. So it's an important point for you to consider. And I encourage you to think about it this way. If it is really important for you to disclose during the job search process, we absolutely want you to be making the choices and conducting your job search in a way that feels right for you. What we recommend is waiting to disclose until you've had at least one person interview. And that is because when you've only communicated using a resume or a cover letter or cover email, it's just a written document, and it doesn't fully capture the essence of who you are, what your energy is, what it's like to spend time with you. And those are factors that are often really key drivers in why people make hiring decisions. So sharing that information as a full human that the interviewer has had a chance to spend time with can land differently than something that they just see written on a piece of paper That's one piece of paper in a pile of other papers that they're looking through. So I'd like to spend some time now talking about the online space. And I want to be very clear as we start this conversation that in no time am I saying that you should avoid talking about your cancer experience online or your cancer diagnosis online. We know that for many, many people, the online space has been really critical in helping them to find community and feel supported during their experience. But we do know that what you post online can have an impact in the workplace. As this slide shows us, employers and hiring managers are both known to Google. In the case of hiring managers, it's usually done because a candidate has crossed their desk and they like what that person brings to the table and they want to find out more about them. In the case of current employers, it's usually that there's a new manager on the job and they're trying to get to know the team that they inherited. And so it's really good intentions that bring them to Google, that they want to find out more about people that they like. But it can also lead to the uncovering of information that you might have preferred be kept out of the workplace. So really important to think carefully about what you're disclosing online. And it is something that we are going to be talking about much more in the next session as well. Also sharing some data points with you from a survey that we did last year that demonstrate that there were, these demonstrate some of the behaviors amongst people who received a diagnosis. Amongst the people we surveyed, about 26% of them had just disclosed online. 29% of the people who had disclosed said they regretted posting information about their cancer diagnosis online, and 41 expressed concern about their employers discovering that their cancer diagnosis because of something that they had shared on social media. So this is really just to give you a sense of what your peers, what their feelings are, what their behaviors are, and to underscore the importance of making careful decisions about what gets posted online. So this is a reminder of a lot of the things that we just talked about. And a final point that I want to make as we're talking about making decisions about whether or not to share online is that there can be a long-term impact to the things that we post. And so it may be the case that for some of you, you've disclosed at work already, everyone is being really supportive, your coworkers are supportive, your boss is super awesome. And that's an outstanding situation to be in. But the fact is that the internet doesn't go away. And so it's important to think beyond the right now, because none of us can predict the future. And so you may find yourself unexpectedly looking for a job 5 years from now, or you may find that your supportive supervisor may move on and be replaced by someone who starts Googling their new staff. And there's no way to know how that person is going to respond to the information they find. So I want to be very clear again that I'm not saying never disclose online, just that we want you to make informed choices that you feel good about. So that's where we're going to leave off for today. Before we move on to Q&A, just a quick moment for you to look at the top takeaways from this session, which are that effective communications can be important either when you're working or when you're looking for work. Understanding your communication style as well as others can help improve communication, and thinking through disclosure decisions and how they impact workplace communications is a very important practice. Also, a quick teaser for what's going to happen in our next session. So we're going to start by talking about best practices for using social media and online platforms to create an online brand. So if you have questions about that, those are going to be answered in your next session. Tips and techniques for having conversations at work and when looking for a new job. And we'll also talk about communications during the job search process. So now I'm going to turn it back to Nicole. I think we maybe have a few minutes for Q&A. And she's gonna share a few more details and let us know how to do that.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. I know that was a lot of information to fit into an hour, so I'm glad we were able to do it. Before we move into the Q&A portion, I just want to point out a number of our free events coming up. If you don't mind just going to the next slide, Rachel. We have a number of remaining webinar sessions through our Balancing Work and Cancer series. So as Rachel mentioned, we have the Communicating Effectively Part 2 coming up next month, as well as Balancing Remote Work and Cancer and Balancing Work and Caregiving. So registration is open for all three of those. We also are really, really excited to introduce our Spanish language Ask the Expert series. So the first one will be taking place next week. These are sessions that are completely in Spanish. So if anyone on this call is a fluent Spanish speaker or knows of someone who might benefit from this information, please let them know. And finally, we have our West Coast Conference on Work in Cancer, which will be virtual again this year and taking place October 22nd, which is a Saturday. If you want to just go to the next slide, and here's just a couple of additional resources. I know Rachel didn't really get into a lot of the legal aspects. We touched on them, but if you'd like more information or would like to speak with someone, here are some really great resources for doing so. Next slide. And again, contact information for Rachel and all of Cancer and Careers social media handles, as well as our website. And I think we have one more slide, and then we'll just leave up the CEU requirements while we jump into Q&A. We'll try to take one or two questions. Again, I know we started a little late today, so we don't want to keep everybody past the hour, but I do know that we do have a couple of questions. So for those of you who have submitted them or have other questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. If we don't get to them today, we'll be sure to get you answers following the session. Okay. Do you want to take a look at them, Rachel, or should I just?
Sure. Let's see what we've got here. Well, through a line. Okay. So I'm seeing a few questions about related to legal issues. So we've got some questions about how long you are covered by protections after treatment for cancer, how to request accommodations on the job. So I will say that I'm not an attorney, and best practices are going to vary. How long you have entitlement to protections is going to vary depending on your individual circumstances. So I know that that is not a great answer to anything, but I do want to make sure that you have the most effective information possible, and that we don't take the chance of communicating something that is going to be not helpful. So if you do have specific questions about legal information, again, I'm going to recommend that you check out some of the other webinars that we have posted on our website and informational articles. You can also send us an email at cancerandcareers@cew.org, and we can set up a time to talk to you a little bit more about your specific situation and see if we are able to, give you some specific details, or if we can make a referral for you for somebody who is a legal expert and can give you more specific information. So that's that. And then there's a question here that says, how do I manage requests? There is one question that I do want to address, which is, how do I manage requests for accommodations on the job when I'm still learning day by day how to navigate my disability? And I think that that's a really important question, because as I mentioned, the cancer experience does tend to be fluid. We tend to discover new things as we're going along. The way that a first chemotherapy treatment impacts us is not necessarily the way that the sixth one is going to impact us. Side effects can snowball, and so on and so forth. And so I think an important thing to know is that when it comes to accommodations, it should be an ongoing conversation. We've talked throughout the session about how, effective communications are so often ongoing conversation. But I think as you're learning and as you're going along, it's important, as you have the conversations, to communicate again, this is what I know today. What's going on today is this. And then perhaps end each conversation after you discuss the particulars of that moment in time, and it's going to work for you and all of that, to perhaps set up a specific time to then revisit the dialogue. Maybe that's a month, maybe that's a week, whatever you think might work. Sending a follow-up communication after having a conversation is something else that can be used to great effect in this particular scenario. you sit down, you say, hey, I'd like to talk about what's going on right now. It's ever evolving. And so I just wanted to update you on where I am. You talk about that and you talk about potential solutions. And then after the conversation, you could send an email that says, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down for me today. Just to recap, I look forward to employing that solution, talk about any next steps that you might need to take and that you plan on taking, all of that. And so then if you need to revisit the conversation later, you have that email thread that you can go back to and say, as per our last conversation, I wanted to follow up again because things have evolved. And so remembering that conversations can be ongoing and should be ongoing, and really, finding a way to make that work for you. So that's that. And I see that there are still a bunch of questions coming in, but I'm also seeing that we're about 3 minutes after the hour, which is exactly 60 minutes after we started. So on that note, I think we're probably going to have to call it for today. If you would like to forward your question to us via email, please do so. And we will do our best to get back to you as soon as we can after today's event. And our email address, I'm actually going to type that into the chat box. It's cancerandcareers@cew.org. And so we look forward to hearing from you and hopefully seeing many of you at our next session on October 5th.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you all for attending today.